Welcome
Sorry.
to the Mop Up, where we break down Commander gameplay and discuss lessons learned along the way.
We're going to talk about some of our own gameplay, general mechanics, and overall experiences playing the game of Commander.
Ooh
And
la
today,
la.
our topic is all about threat assessment.
And so, Ken, how would you define threat assessment?
I would say for me, threat assessment is when you're sitting down and you're with your pod. When does a player get to a point with their gameplay overall that the alarm bells start ringing in your head? When is this person in a state of either being able to win the game or just absolutely obliterate everyone else on their way to winning the game? So being able to identify kind of when that moment is or right before it happens, I think is what we would refer to as threat assessment.
So, to kind of break that down a little bit more, if it seems like someone's going to win, or if they're going to get so much advantage that they will eventually win the game, is basically how you would break down
Exactly.
that. Yeah.
Yep.
Sick. Okay.
E.
So when you're playing the game, I think a lot of people have different ideas of like what they think the threat is based on their threat assessment, and that comes down to knowledge of what's in their hand, knowing what their deck can do, and then maybe not knowing how to respond to certain threats with other players. So sometimes you get like different perspectives on that, but it's also important to remember that when you are making threat assessments, that you don't know what's in everyone's hand. So it's really important to keep that in mind. So don't get mad at people because everyone's going to make decisions based on what they think is the best thing to do. And if it turns out to be the wrong thing, oh well, it's magic. You learn, you scoop up, play a different game. But going
Exactly.
into, sorry, what were you saying?
Oh, no, I was just gonna say the same thing. So for today, we've kind of broken it down into kind of a few little categories that you can try and pick up or identify when a threat needs to be assessed. So Ash, do you want to kind of knock off or start us off the first one?
Yeah. So I think like threat assessment starts even before you start playing the game. And what I mean by that is if you're at a table, LGS or something, and you don't necessarily know everyone, a lot of times you're going to base your threat assessment off of what commanders people are playing. So for me, I usually look at a commander and the things that stick out to me are they a card draw engine? Do I know that they have like two card combo pieces? Is it removal in the command zone? Do they provide passive value just by playing the game? So, example, commanders with landfall effects and stuff like that. But what do you
Right,
look
your
for?
Tatiovas, your
Mm-hmm.
Chulanes. I think those are all examples of like, oh, this commander is going to perform, or I would even say overperform, no matter what the game situation is.
Don't forget
So I think
Omnath.
being able to kind of, oh, your
Omnath.
favorite
It just
Omnath.
is
Yeah,
gross. It just like all you do is play a land and you get so much value. Like that's
right.
so I think a
And
good
I mean,
example.
and I think a lot of kind of the overall community has kind of been able to do a good job of identify the commanders that kind of are immediate red flags for a lot of people, right? So I mean, I think a good resource if you're kind of new, you're wanting to build something, but you don't want to build that commander that might be a remove on site commander. Sources like EDA Trek do a really good job of kind of breaking down. You know, they have the salt meter to kind of give you a good idea
Mm-hmm.
of is this commander something people fear, or is it something that's maybe a more suitable and more enjoyable for everyone?
And even with that, like you can build that commander, but just make sure like you one break it down in like your rule zero conversations and stuff, but also acknowledge that you might just be arch enemy right off the bat. And some people love playing arch enemy, but sometimes you do go sit down at a table and someone can get mad because they're like, why are you targeting me? And it's like, well, I can't let Tulane stay on the board, or I can't let XYZ commander stay on the board because if they do, you
Right.
win. And I think like, is it Joda the Unifier is a good example of a commander that is so good, but a lot of times, at least in gameplay, and this is of course anecdotal like evidence here, but just watching
Right.
gameplay or sitting in pods, everyone's so scared of that commander they remove it right away. Same with like a Troxa. Like they're so scary that people want to remove them right away. So you either have to adapt to the mindset of knowing if you play that commander, they're going to get removed a lot, or figure out how to deck build in a way where it's like, how do I keep that commander protected? And how do I deal with
Right.
the fact that I might be arch enemy at the table? And
And I
also,
think,
do you want to
oh, go
define
ahead.
arch enemy? Because I realized I didn't do that.
Yeah, you bet. So, arch enemy is pretty much the player who commands the most um, attention, who runs the biggest threats, who's most likely to always kind of run and get far in the lead. I think the arch enemy kind of always defaults down to the player who would be in the lead, but some decks and some commanders kind of just put you in that seat right from the beginning, whether you like it or not. So I think that kind of is a good segue into the second part, is deck assessment and kind of how can you convey your deck in a way that maybe doesn't set off all these red flags for other players. So maybe if you have an example of that, or
Yeah, so I've played against a couple of different decks where someone's like, "Oh, it's this commander, but don't worry, it's not that like kind of build." So an example would be
right,
like if a commander is known for a specific combo or like specific things that would be giving it a bad reputation. So if it's known as more of like a stacks build commander, oh, I didn't put stack pieces in my deck. It's just like I thought its, death trigger ability or draw card ability was
right,
cool. And I think some people, especially if you're playing with a group that's just a random pickup game, will probably not, just because of bad experiences at other pods, not
right,
take your word at face value. And so, like, just knowing that alone, like, I've definitely like pulled out combo pieces and like, rule zero conversations and say like if you see these three things or if you see two of these things, uh start shutting me down because I'm probably going to combo off. And not every player has to do that, but I just do it because I feel like it teaches newer players, but also like makes people feel more comfortable like playing. But it also again depends if you know how experienced the table is, if you know the people you're playing with. So
right. I think another thing too that's important, especially for newer players or players who want to build these more notorious decks, but maybe not in the way that people think, is ask your play group if they have experience with these commanders, with these decks. It could be really good information to kind of be like, why does this commander scare you? Kind of what are the cards that are notorious with it,
mhm.
and you can from there kind of decide, oh, do I want to go in that direction and kind of lean into it and become kind of the bad guy of the play table, or do I want to kind of steer away and create something that's a lot more, you know, fun
Silly.
overall
Yeah.
and kind of level? Yeah, because you can still make the jankiest decks with the most powerful commanders, and they're not always going to be great, but they still have the potential.
Yeah. I think like I made a Go Shintai deck and that's like a menace and historic brawl, but it's also
Hmm.
one that I try to do based on an Elden Ring theme. So I have like a ton of
Oh,
non-enchantment like synergies and like this card represents this boss or this represents like rot, and it's again like a card that has
right,
no synergy. But if you do have other pieces that the commander does synergize well with, like you just bring down the overall like impact of what it can do, where
right,
it's not necessarily like high power CDH, but it could still be powerful in of itself. So again, it kind of
yeah,
just depends on the pod, and if it still feels too broken, you
yeah,
can always switch out and stuff. So
right. So we've got our commanders picked out. We've talked about our decks. Now we're in the game. Board states are starting to develop. We're kind of looking around, starting to see what's going on and kind of be like, oh, I might, those alarm bells might start triggering. What are some things, for example, that you would see on a board state that kind of starts putting those red flags up for you?
yeah, I think a big part of it kind of depends on a couple of things. And I think as you get more experienced with the game, it's easier to kind of understand how the puzzle pieces come together. But
Right.
usually, if there's something that is going to put my opponent way far ahead of everyone else, that's like oh, I got to get rid of that kind of thing. And a good example,
Yeah.
I think, is like Smothering Tithe, because like if I ever see that card just sitting on the table and no one removes it, like it pops off. Like they get, they win, like basically, because they get so
Right.
much more mana. Because most people are going to be willing to pay for like the Esper Sentinel tax, which is one, and keeping someone from drawing a card. Sometimes
Right.
people will pay for a little bit of Rhystic Study, but once it hits the two mana with Southern Tithe, nobody pays for it.
Right. And I think those all I would say even all the cards that kind of tax in that way are, you know, you can try and you can keep up the facade, you can keep paying those taxes, but after a certain point it just becomes like, well, what's the point? No one else is. I'm wasting my resources. So yeah, I think those cards are, I mean, they're notorious, but also they're cards to keep an eye out for because those can get away real fast and sometimes
Hmm.
it kind of comes right from under your nose and you don't realize it till it's too late.
Yeah. And I
Um,
think those
I
that's a good
think
point. Slow build, like in that sense.
right,
Yeah.
yeah. I think another kind of talking about resources and card draw. Another one that for me personally recently happened is a player who, let's say, spends their turn, you know, casting an Expel, casting a Seagate Restoration, a Sphinx's Revelation, draws a whole bunch of cards, passes a turn. Immediately, when that player untaps, they're going to have so many resources and possibly the ability to really run away with the game. So I think that's another thing that people maybe won't immediately think of. But how many cards does everyone have in hand, right? If someone
Mhm.
has a lot of resources, have a lot of cards, I would say that you need to start at least keeping an eye out for that player because, I
Yeah.
mean, they got all kinds of scary things in those hands.
Yeah. So I guess like if we're gonna break that down based on just what we were summarizing is if someone got way ahead on ramp, so they have a lot of mana, and way ahead
Yep.
on card draw. Because if you think about like casual mid power kind of games, typically the people who win are the ones that made the most mana the quickest and drew the most cards. And basically it's like
Hmm.
a resource war in that sense.
Right, yeah. Ramp again, kind of relating to that as well, is how fast is a certain player or a couple players in your pod? How fast are they ramping? How many lands do they have? I mean, if you are you getting to turn 6 and turn 7 and everyone's, you know, playing their 7th land drop and somebody's like untapping with 20
Yeah.
lands, right? Right. Resources like that, you know, sometimes you're like, oh, a cultivate, a sky shroud claim. Oh, that doesn't affect me. That's fine. What's the worst that could happen? The worst could happen. It will happen.
Yes. I was thinking like a good example is probably the game that you played against with me like recently where I had a Luna Apex of Wishes and I essentially
Yes.
cascaded into an old Gnawbone, which then I had just yeah, go ahead.
Well, no, it was your commander triggered and cascaded you into Itali, which then cascaded you
The new
into the old
Itali. That's
Nabo.
right. That was
Yeah, and a
gross.
bunch of other really good stuff from everyone else.
And
Yeah,
I
it
think
was like
everything had
a.
haste. So I like made what like
Hmm.
30 mana out of nowhere in one turn. And so like that's an example right there is like okay, even if everyone has 8 lands, now I just made 30 mana, which means I can dump like more resources out. And I think
Right,
like that is a good example of like a card to get
right.
out because that gave me insane value.
Right. So again, I think that's a good segue into um, talking about creatures, and I think this is going to be obviously it's going to vary for each person, each player, and their
Hmm.
personal experiences. But I thought it'd be fun we could kind of like discuss some of our personal big threat, scary like kill on sight creatures. I know, well, Old Gnawbone and Italia, I think, are obviously the first two that make those lists based on recent experience. But do you have any that kind of come to mind immediately?
I think for it really depends on the color pie that you're going up against because there's some creatures where I'm like, oh, like that would be scary if you had access to like maybe a swamp or other kind of
Right.
things. But if it's certain monocolor stuff, I might be more like, I'll see where that goes and hold up my removal. Or maybe in some cases, like if there's a creature that I know my opponents can't deal with, but I can deal with it, maybe I'll let it stay on the board because I think for like a lot of newer players, anytime you see something scary, you're instantly like, oh, that person's the threat, that person's the threat. But if you know
Right.
how to like use your opponent's
Finesse.
advantage to your advantage, that could be cool.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes hard to gauge as well because maybe you let something stay on the board for too long and that person gets all the advantage against you. So I think like
Right.
breaking it down in those kind of pieces, like cards that I've lost to like really severely, if I just don't have an answer for them, are going to be like Emoti, because they cascade into so many broken things. And another
Mhm.
thing is Terror of the Peaks, where they're dealing damage based on attack power to any target. Marionette Master, I've lost to a lot. And a lot of times people are just like, oh,
Immediate
it's not a
death.
big deal. Yeah, it's like,
Right.
no, because like even if you blow up that creature, they can sacrifice like 5 treasure tokens in response. That resolves first
Yep.
and you die. So
If
then
it's
your
on the
removal.
battlefield,
Yeah. So like,
if it hits the battlefield, it's too late.
yeah.
You're
I,
done.
so I think like if I'm gonna break it down of like, is there a creature that's gonna give explosive sudden value out of nowhere? Is there a creature that is going to make it so that if it resolves, you're not going to be able to deal with it? And I think those are
Right.
kind of the two big things. And again, we don't all know each other's like hands, what we all kind of have experience wise with certain creatures, but like
Right.
I think we can look at any of the Eldrazi like scary creatures and be like, oh no, I'm gonna counter that. I don't want that to hit the board. But I think it's sometimes the more
Right.
subtle things that like again, Marionette Master, where in response you can just sacrifice something. Jury I lost to recently because it got really big, and I was like, I
Hmm.
could try to exile it, but if I exile it, they sacrifice it in response. So the only way I could not die to that would be if I had like some sort of effect that does a replacement effect. So if you sacrifice, it gets exiled, or if I phased out and hoped it didn't hit me or
Right.
something.
I think
Like,
I think Jury is a perfect example of threat of activation too.
mhm.
It's sometimes the creatures aren't like outright terrifying. Sometimes it's just having them and knowing that they can, you know, oh, you can target it. You can target this jury, but the minute you do, it's coming at you. And then I mean, that's also a lot of the fun and the politics kind of a 4-player commander is
Yeah,
nobody
that
wants to
too.
be that person, right? Everyone wants to keep their low profile. I think a couple that kind of stand out for me, kind of you're saying the Eldrazi's are all kind of like I would say pretty much most Eldrazi will automatically fill that role.
Yeah.
I think the Phyrexian Praetors are another one too, right? I mean, I've been hosed by
Oh yeah.
Vorinclex, tapping down all my lands.
They did
Um,
that too.
New and old too, right? New Vorinclex, well, new, I guess middle Vorinclex now because there's 3 of each, can instantly alt planeswalkers. So I think any of the Praetors, usually once they're down, you got to kind of keep an eye out for that. And I
Hmm.
think another one too that maybe goes understated and is another example of like, ooh, it might be too late by the time it hits is like a Massacre Worm
I love
that
Massacre Worm.
can just. Oh, me too. It's like a personal favorite. But like once that thing hits, if there's lots of little dinky creatures out, I think we're dead.
Yeah. Kind of like Grey Merchant of Asphodel too. That's the one where
Yep.
it drains each opponent based on your devotion to black. But the reason why it's also scary is if you see it hit the graveyard, someone has a reanimation spell. Like if someone discards it,
Right.
that should be an instant like, oh no, they're about to like drain everyone.
Oh.
Yeah. So
Right.
that's like an example too of threat assessment, which I forgot to say earlier based on board states was graveyard. If someone has a chunky graveyard and it's just hanging out, get rid of it. And specifically, if it's black or red and even green now and even white,
Green.
actually
What?
blue. You know what? Everything. Get rid of it. No one
Everything.
gets graveyards.
Just play graveyard removal. That's
Yep.
the story.
There we go. Yeah. I was like, wait,
Pachukabog. It comes in tapped, but it can save your
it
life.
has on so many occasions.
Right.
Yeah. So there we go.
Yeah. So I think Gary is, and Massacre Worm 2 kind of also fall in the last kind of little area we want to talk about is like the win con cards. The
Hmm.
cards that are in there to finish out the game. And can you do anything to deal with them beforehand? Well, as we kind of learn with things like Marionette Master, Massacre Worm, Gary, is like you just have to keep those things from hitting the battlefield, right? So I
Yeah.
think from there it's a lot of like counter spells or like a reprieve and white now that you can kind of just boop bounce it back and hope they can't recast it. But yeah, I think I'm not sure if there's any other kind of win cons that you had in mind that are like
Oh yeah. So I already hit on like kind of the Marionette Master win con effects, but one that I also see a lot too is like Aetherflux Reservoir. That one's a pain in the butt.
Mhm.
Chroma's Will, and then even Ink Shield. Those kind of like Ink Shield's a really fun way to win.
Loving shit.
I love it. It's like one of my favorite win cons. But like, if you see 5 open mana and they're playing in white and black, be careful.
Right.
That's an
Yeah.
Ink
Another one
Shield.
too that we've kind of recently experienced in a possible forthcoming Good Clean Commander episode is are people putting down cards like Laboratory Maniac or Jace, where it's any card that says if you draw a card and you have no cards left, you win the game? Something's happening. It's
Yeah.
coming. Red flags, alarm bells start going because usually that means that they're either 1 or 2 steps away from being able to close out a game right kind of out of
Yeah.
nowhere. So
Like showing their win con. If they can't win that turn, but they're showing you the win con of something like that, then they're probably going to win on their upkeep. That's a good way. Like, are
right.
they telegraphing that they have something? I think is a good point too.
Yeah. So I think with all that, kind of everything we've covered, now the question is, how do we deal with the threat? What is the answer to threat assessment? And I think there's two, and possibly only two, I think at least. And the first one is running interaction,
Mm-hmm.
being able to deal with whatever's happening, right? Interaction is removal, board wipes, counter
Counters.
spells. Yep,
Exile.
counters,
Graveyards.
graveyard exiling. Yeah. All those count kind of as forms of interactions, way that you can disrupt essentially what the person who's about to win or the person who's kind of snowballing, trying to kind of slow them down and cut off the resources right before it's too late too.
Mhm.
And I think the other solution to dealing with the threat is outpacing them and trying to be the threat yourself and beating them to the finish line.
I thought you were going to say politics.
I mean, well,
So there's
politics
3
too.
now?
Politics have varying levels of success. I can't and wholeheartedly recommend that all the time. But
No.
I think the other option is if you're able to just kind of snowball faster than that player, then sometimes you just kind of have to make break, and it will be a race to the finish line.
Yeah.
Um,
I've definitely had like politics where I was like, if you don't do this, I won't do this. And they're like, okay. And then they're like, actually, I'm going to win this turn. So I'm like, but you took the deal and you said you weren't going to do anything. That's how politics works.
Are you referencing me in some past? I don't
No,
remember. Because
no.
that sounds like something that could happen.
No, this is like earlier years of me playing, but I was just like, isn't the point of making deals? Because otherwise it's just benefited you. Like,
Right.
and then no one wants to
Especially
make
going
deals.
back on it. Yeah, that's
That could
funny.
probably be a whole
But,
episode in of itself. Like threat assessment and politics.
Politics. And I think another one too that you kind of touched on that I think we're probably going to do a separate episode, maybe after this one, is discussing when to use removal. Because especially for newer players, it seems pretty straightforward, but kind of as you get more into the game, it's a lot more nuanced than you could think. So
Yeah.
look forward to that in the future.
Especially understanding the stack and how interaction can work as the stack resolves. So that's another fun one.
You bet. But for now, that's our little spiel on threat assessment.
Yeah.
Is there are there any cards that you kind of flag as immediate threats? Let us know in the comments. I think it's kind of fun when people are able to kind of share their little stories or their experiences with certain cards. Because sometimes cards that are just, you wouldn't bat an eye to for one player is like someone else's mortal enemy. So I think it's kind of fun to have that conversation.
Yeah. Because it definitely depends on like your meta, who you play with consistently. And if you don't have a consistent play group, I think you build your decks a lot different than someone who does have a consistent play group. So it's fun to
Absolutely.
see everyone's thoughts and influences there.
You bet.
Yeah.
But that's about what we have today. We would greatly appreciate it if you like, subscribe, and like I said, leave a comment. Let us know the things that terrify you and keep you up at night.
Yeah, sure. That's how we want to end that. All right. Thanks for watching.
All right.
And bye.
Have a good one. Goodbye.
Get out of here.